In France this Thursday, the funerals of victims of last week's terror attacks, emotion still running high in a nation that's rallied with huge national unity marches, a rush on newsstands to buy the next issue of Charlie Hebdo, and a stirring Marseillaise sung in the French Parliament. But what will lawmakers now do in the name of those who said they marched for freedom of speech? With plans to widen internet surveillance and get big tech names like Google and Facebook to cooperate more closely, some wonder if France is headed for its own equivalent of the Patriot Act, the measure that was enacted in the U.S. in reaction to the September 11th bombings. And with most of the world's internet giants American, that's high on the agenda as the British Prime Minister visits the White House this Thursday. David Cameron, who's promised broader cyber snooping laws if he's re-elected in the spring. As for the French, well, they're already cracking down on hate speech. Already more than 50 cases lodged, including against controversial satirist Dieudonné over his Je suis Charlie Koulibaly Facebook posting, a nod to both Charlie Hebdo and the kosher grocery store attacker Amédi Koulibaly. A necessary red line drawn by the state against hate, or a double standard when it comes to free speech? Today in the France 24 debate, policing the internet after the Paris terror attacks. With us to talk about it, Nathalie Goulet. She chairs the French Senate's Commission on Jihadist Networks.
Good evening.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks as well to human rights attorney Mugambi Jouet. Welcome back.
Good evening.
Mugambi, the author of Obama and the Pitfalls of September 11th. By the way, it's not one counselor we have, but two attorneys, since we're also joined by intellectual property lawyer Etienne Drouin. Oh, Nathalie Goulet, three. Make it three. All right, so the lone man out is Fabrice Appelboin. He teaches, most notably, information warfare.
Yeah.
Cybersecurity is one of the topics you focus on at the prestigious French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po, the France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter, our hashtag F24debate. To give you a flavor, Charlie Hebdo selling out for the second day running this Thursday. We can show you two of the front pages that you could find in newsstands. Conservative broadsheet, Le Figaro. They headline, Hollande puts the armed forces at the heart of his counter-offensive against terror, while left-leaning tabloid Libération screams, freedom of speech, warning, fragile. With a background there, you see little slurs that run the full gamut, from insults to religion to journalist is one of them. Anyway, what should be the focus now? Which of those two makes a better headline in your view, Nathalie Goulet?
Well, Libération probably. Well, it's a very difficult balance, you know. Where we have to think about that. For the time being, we are under the emotional shock. You know, people are totally like drunk. You know, we really have a big problem, and right now we are just facing the reactions. I think that we will have this national unit for some time, and then try to pass and to react by probably by law, by other measures. I'm not very in favor of new law regarding the situation, but we'll see.
All right, they are talking about new laws. We're going to spell out some of them. First of all, Mugambi Jouet, how would you describe the post-January 7th mood in this country when you compare to September 11th? And you were in New York for that.
I was indeed in New York on 9/11, and the reaction has been very different. First of all, because 9/11 was a major shock to the vast majority of the American population, whereas the recent terrorist attacks in Paris come after over a decade of what has been dubbed the war on terror. Secondly, there's been a major difference because many Americans immediately called for war after the 9/11 attacks, and that was indeed a major part of the response of the U.S. government, with first the invasion of Afghanistan with the support of France and a number of other nations, and thereafter in 2003, the very controversial invasion of Iraq by President Bush. And One difference is that France has not suggested so far any such military measures. However, one parallel is that after 9/11 in the U.S., there was a lot of debate over enhancing the national security apparatus, and that's also an ongoing debate now in France after these atrocious attacks.
It is. We saw the president saying he may hit the pause button on defense cuts. We saw the prime minister promise new legislation. We'll talk about that. But there's something that's actually concretely going on now. We spelled it out in our introduction, and that is this crackdown on hate speech that we've seen in the past week. Your thoughts on that?
It's a very controversial question because the law must find the right balance between free speech and also repressing speech that is hateful, speech that calls for violence against all people, especially vulnerable individuals. And France is currently facing that debate.
All right. We saw one of those who could be convicted is the satirist Dieudonné. In the past, he's been denounced for his stand-up show deemed anti-Semitic. He wrote "Je suis Charlie Koulibaly." Is it worth going to jail for that?
Maybe. I mean, nobody knows because the first applications of this new law against hate speech, when it deals with online communication and support to terrorism, was enacted in November 2014. The first decision last week. So it will be one of the first creating case law with that. So
what's
frankly,
your reaction?
I don't know.
You've seen more than 50 cases that have been brought before courts right now. What's your thought on that?
It was a starting point.
So it's a good thing.
I would say that there was a lot of criticism before, because when for the first attacks last year that we had in Toulouse, there were more than 3,000 messages like that and only 20 convictions. So they started with a stronger position with these first 50 decisions. I'm not sure it will be efficient, but at least it creates a doubt. I'm afraid that there would be a side effect because people will be more professional in their communication, maybe discreet, but still dangerous. This is not the case for this tweet from Dieudonné, but for the other ones, I'm afraid it could just create a secret communication.
Now, civil libertarians would tell you that saying "Je suis Charlie Koulibaly," it's a tasteless joke.
Yes, and obviously, if it was done in the United States, nothing would happen. But in France, we don't have at all the same kind of freedom of speech. Freedom of speech in France is very different from freedom of speech as the world knows it, which is American culture. We don't have anything like the First Amendment, and the freedom of speech in France is very seriously limited by many numbers of law that provide protection for minority oppression. But the reality is that many forms of speech are not allowed in the French media, on Facebook or on Twitter, and this is becoming very difficult because Twitter, Facebook are American, and they have been designed with the First Amendment in mind. The First Amendment, in some way, is coded inside those online services, and censoring them is going to be extremely difficult, especially for Facebook.
So is it a good thing or a bad thing that the internet falls under the U.S. interpretation of free speech?
Well, it depends on your view on freedom of speech. If you like,
what about Fabrice Epelbrun's
I really appreciate the American view on freedom of speech. We have a very major politician in France named Simone Veil, who also supports this kind of freedom of speech. Of course, Noam Chomsky in the United States is the key figure of this kind of freedom of speech, but the fact is it's very, very different in France.
So you disagree with Etienne Drouat, who says this is a good first step to trying to curb...
Oh yeah, totally. I think
speech.
It's a good first step for creating a martyrdom out of this guy, and we don't need this.
Nathalie Goulet?
Well, just can we laugh about everything? You know, that is the point. And anti-Semitism is not laughable at all. I mean, it's not an opinion. It's just against the law. So I think that regarding the increasing way of anti-Semitism and act of anti-Semitism, I think that the court are going to react. Mm-hmm. And that is a point also.
Yes. There is no doubt that this "Je suis Charlie Koulibaly" may be regarded as a support to terrorism.
Absolutely.
No doubt. No doubt that the law is applicable to this situation.
Mugambi Jouet, would you rather be the prosecutor or the defense attorney in this case?
In general, I would err on the side of freedom of speech. That being said, it's important to understand the historical factors that explain the difference between the U.S. and France in this regard, which is that, unlike the United States, France was occupied during World War II by the Third Reich, and also because of that history, neo-Nazi speech or anti-Semitic speech is much more repressed in France than in the U.S., and that historical background is key to understanding how French law has evolved as opposed to U.S. law.
All right, we talked about anti-Semitic speech. There's been a lot of Islamophobic acts, attacks against mosques and places of worship. The education minister notes more than 200 incidents where there's been a backlash. Cases of hate speech reported in junior high schools and high schools across France since last week. Of course, that's out of 67,000 schools. It may seem small, 200, but it's much more than a drop in the bucket, says Najat Vallaud-Belkacem.
These incidents occurred across France, and in that sense, the issues in schools are a reflection of the larger society, which leads us to think about how we instill our values in schools by teaching them to children on a daily basis. How do we instill critical thinking, the ability to debate, and to work together? Which is why I said yesterday that on some level, our schools haven't been good enough. Until now, they haven't been able to develop these things for children.
Parce qu'elle n'a pas su développer tout ça chez les enfants.
All right, so rather than see it in terms of a prosecution, there the education minister saying we have to do a better job of having a conversation when it comes to free speech and religion.
Well, not only schools, but also the parents. You know, those children who didn't want to respect a minute of silence and everything, and then are yelling, and you know, it's what they are listening at home. I mean, that is not coming from school, and it's not coming from themselves. Education, it's also what happened at home, and we also have to think about that.
And do you think as though the internet
and maybe the lack of attention of the parents, of the speech that the parents have together, and what happened at home, because the children, you know, they reproduce what they listen at home. As every children, you know, they just duplicate what they are used to listen to. And that is also a main problem, really.
Do you feel as though people who are of the Muslim faith in France can feel stigmatized in the past week?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's a good thing that the Minister of Interior decided to put some armed forces in front of the mosque, and as well as in front of the synagogue. I mean, they are absolutely on the same level for the protection, and I think it's a very good thing not to make any difference between religious churches or Muslim mosques.
Fabrice Appelboin, one of the things that's come up a lot in the conversation in the last 24 hours especially is this question of, is there a double standard when it comes to these laws?
Well, it depends if you're against Islam, or if you're against Jewish religion, or if you're sexist, or if you're racist, or if you're homophobic, then yes, you don't have any access to freedom of speech. So once again, the way of seeing things in France is that any kind of profanity is allowed. It's in the very root of the French Revolution, but there is no hate speech allowed, especially when it comes to recent French history. I mean, the Second World War, the Nazi Germany was occupying France, and obviously there was some sort of collaboration going on between some French people and the Nazi regime, which has led to hundreds of thousands of deaths. And this history has been treated just like the rest of French history
but
by
those kids who are putting tweets out, they don't get that.
Oh, no, not at all. What they get is what they see on TV, which is American TV shows showcasing the First Amendment and the way of living of the First Amendment. This is why they think they deserve some kind of freedom of speech, but they're talking about the American freedom of speech.
Nathalie Goulet?
I don't think they go so far. The good thing with anti-Semitism is that you get anti-Semitism even in some places where you don't have Jews, which is very interesting. But it's a long history. I mean, if you want to make some talk show about anti-Semitism, you will need 6 years, or 6 months, or 6 centuries, because we never finish with anti-Semitism. No, I think the problem is really important, and it's a lack of education. I think that to put the Minister of Education in the picture is really important. And we are talking about included history of religion, because our worst enemy is ignorance. The people, they don't know anything about Islam, they don't know anything about Judaism, and they don't know anything about Christianity, because they don't learn anything anymore about religion. So they are just repeating what they are listening outside of the school.
All right, and the French government, Mugambi Drouet, its decision to crack down?
Well, you mentioned the case against Dieudonné, the very controversial comedian who makes a lot of anti-Semitic remarks, and whether one is in favor or opposed to that prosecution, in any event, is only the tip of the iceberg. But the really interesting question is why this comedian has become so popular, and arguably he's played a major role in promoting anti-Semitism. And that relates to some of the issues that were evoked by some of the other commentators, which is that in France, there's a major social divide, and a certain segment of the French population, especially wayward youth from immigrant backgrounds, some of whom are Muslim, do not feel at home in France. They feel discriminated against. They feel like they're second or third class citizens, and therefore they look for scapegoats. And historically, Jews have been scapegoats, and that's one of the reasons why Dieudonné has been very effective at promoting anti-Semitism and gaining and following, which is part of the context behind the cases against him.
And do you agree with Fabrice Epelboin when he says that these strong hate crime laws serve his cause because he can act like a martyr?
It's a very controversial question, but to an extent, yes, it makes him much more prominent, the fact that he's being prosecuted.
Etienne Drouat?
This is not a reason for not doing anything.
All right, and not doing anything, that brings us to the other issue, which is, again, what's going to happen now. And the first point, and we're going to bring it up again when we talk about internet surveillance, is the courts. They seem overwhelmed when it comes to deeming what is hate speech and what isn't.
Yes, and I'm afraid that we take too much time with this procedure instead of having a higher level of involvement of judges and judicial courts.
So you need more judges.
We need more judges, and we need them to be involved in procedures against terrorism so that internet surveillance,
now, when you say judges, do you mean judges or investigating magistrates?
Both.
Investigating magistrates and judges to control the procedure so that we know who watched the watchman. And this is the typical issue we have with these laws adopted in France during the last 14 months, 3 of them, addressing how we can identify people on the web, who should cooperate with the police services, what is the role of internet service providers with telecommunication operators. These laws were modifications of the existing legal framework.
All right, so new laws already on the books, and
yes,
we are talking about more when we come back.
Exactly.
We'll pick up on that point with you, Etienne Drouat. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.